ready to get started? Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. We're delighted tonight to have our second lecture this year, hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. And it's my pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Joanna Steinglass to talk to us about her work on Anorexia Nervosa's stubborn grip. This wonderful series of lectures is made possible through the generosity of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, which we're really grateful for, both for hosting this series of talks as well as partnering with us more broadly in our education efforts to bring neuroscience to the public through education for children in high schools as well. Before I tell you a little bit about Joanna's work, please join me in welcoming the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and thanking them for their support. It's an exciting time at Columbia right now for neuroscience-related research. For those of you who don't know, many of us have moved into the new green building, hosting the Zuckerman Institute for Mind, Brain, and Behavior. And this series is really meant to represent a lot of that excitement. Joanna Steinglass, whom I'm lucky enough also to call not just a colleague, but a collaborator, I think really represents the potential and the excitement and the importance of studying the brain, not just for understanding human behavior in all its bizarre mysteries, but for using that knowledge to try to understand and advance treatment of disease. And Dr. Steinglass really is an extraordinary person in that position, coming from the clinical world, reaching out to brain sciences to ask, what do we know about basic brain function that we can further interrogate and that we can use to help people who are suffering from disease? So I think without further ado, let me ask Dr. Joanna Steinglass to join us and share her work with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. It was lovely to be introduced by you. I really want to thank the Niarchos Foundation and the Zuckerman Institute for having me here. It's really an honor to be able to talk to the community and tell you what we've been working on and what we think about anorexia nervosa. What I'm going to try to do tonight is tell you a story about what we think is going on in the brain and the new path that we're on in really learning about what brain mechanisms are contributing to people being stuck in this very severe and dangerous illness. To tell you that story, I have to start by making sure that we all have the same understanding of what anorexia nervosa is and why we've chosen to focus so closely on eating behavior in anorexia nervosa. So I'm going to convince you, I hope, that this is the key place to focus our understanding. And then I'm going to tell you what we've learned about behavior and the brain and how we think that impacts the illness and then the treatment of the illness. I may not be able to get to all of that, so we'll see how we do, and I will be happy to answer any questions about any parts of it that I gave short shrift to along the way. So let me start by anchoring us in what anorexia nervosa is. One thing to know about this illness is that it's actually an old illness. It was described as relentless pursuit of thinness accompanied by an intense fear of weight gain as long ago as the 1600s, and then in these descriptions of the two women you see drawn there, and then the term was coined in the 1800s by Sir William Gull. That seems like a long time ago to me, but actually the story goes back even further, and there are a lot of reports as far back as saints in the 1400s and things like that, where there are descriptions of women who were foregoing food to the point of death. And the descriptions of these experiences, which have been written up in books called Holy Anorexia, sound in many ways like anorexia nervosa. The reason that I start there is because this kind of description is part of what helps us to know that there's something about this illness that's anchored in the brain. There is something biological underlying anorexia nervosa. For all that we hear about it and think about it in the current cultural context, and we hear so much about the thin ideal and the ways that, that cultural pressures are impacting eating disorders, there's something about anorexia nervosa that goes way back that really suggests that this illness has something biological, and then I think neurobiological to it. So fast forwarding to today, when we talk about anorexia nervosa, it has been defined in the DSM, which is the book of descriptions of all psychiatric illnesses, with these criteria. So the first criterion for anorexia is the maintenance of a significantly low weight. And it's important to remember this, that part of the illness is defined by the inadequate nutrition. And this is accompanied by some form of a fear of weight gain. And the critical piece there is that a person can be understood as having a fear of weight gain because of their inability to gain weight, so that you can actually infer from their behavior. It isn't that somebody has to necessarily describe or articulate that they have a particular fear of weight gain, but if their behavior is such that they aren't able to nourish themselves adequately, then that would fit as that criterion. And then with that, as with any eating disorder, there's some form of a disturbance in the experience of shape or weight, and that can take many different forms. There are two types of anorexia nervosa. There's the restricting subtype, and these are individuals who are underweight or maintaining inadequate body weight entirely through inadequate intake. And then there's another subtype where that restriction of energy intake is accompanied by some other types of eating pathology, like loss of control around eating or compensating for having eaten. And the reason it's worth mentioning that is that sometimes people think that when you see that behavior, it must be bulimia nervosa. So it is important to know that whenever there's that underweight, that the diagnosis of anorexia nervosa, which has that underweight piece, trumps the diagnosis of bulimia nervosa, because we think the starvation piece is so critically important and relevant for the biology of the illness. Who gets anorexia nervosa? It is mostly women, about 1/10 as many men. The mean age of onset is mid to late adolescence, but the mean age in treatment is actually in the mid-20s. So there's a bit of a gap between when people present for treatment and when they first develop the illness. There are signs that that may be improving and people may be getting to treatment earlier. The prevalence is about 1% to 2% of women. It's a little bit hard. The estimates range, but it's something like that. And the main point I would make here is that the prevalence is not increasing. So as far as we have decades worth of good data from electronic health records and such in Europe, and the data from these records indicate that the prevalence stays consistent. And again, that speaks to there is something actually about this illness that is as biological as any other psychiatric illness. A quick tour through what happens and how we help people. The best data are that about 1/3 to 1/2 of adults fully recover, and the prognosis is better for the adolescents than for the adults. So the adolescents actually more like 50% recover, and then with good treatment, even more so. These recovery rates are with treatment, so the treatment piece is really important. It is a very dangerous illness, so there is a mortality rate that's as high as any psychiatric illness, which is up to 5% per decade of follow-up. And then there's a range of people who stay ill, so they continue to struggle with symptoms for a long time, maybe not in quite as severe a range, but they sort of struggle with symptoms for many years. Obesity is something that patients commonly fear, so those who are in treatment commonly fear that if they are trying to gain weight, that is going to go on and on forever. That is very much not the case. The incidence of obesity following anorexia nervosa is quite rare. I'm going to highlight that this is a very dangerous illness. 50% of patients who are hospitalized for anorexia nervosa require rehospitalization within the first year, and the mortality ratio is quite high. This is in part because this is an illness that affects young women. So these people are otherwise healthy, whatever that means, but they're not medically expected to be ill. So when they have an illness like this that's so devastating medically, it can make the mortality rate seem really quite high. And this slide here, I realized I don't know where the little, oh, there it is. This slide here is just showing you a reminder that the longer the illness persists, the more chronic it is, the mortality rate seems to go up with the chronicity of the illness. What do? We renourish people. So the first step of treatment, the critical first stage, is getting people renourished. This can be done in a range of different ways. For the teenagers, we use the families to help renourish people. For adults, we generally use some kind of a structured setting where we can provide behavioral incentives. The main idea here is that something that changes behavior and helps people get renourished is extremely helpful, and medications, intriguingly, have not been helpful. This is only the first step of treatment, so once we get patients renourished, then there's a lot more work to do after that, and it's common for patients to need treatment for, the general recommendation is to think about that next year after hospitalization as really needing to stay in treatment. Okay, so that raises the question. I've told you they have an illness where they're starved. Being starved is incredibly dangerous. It keeps them living in the hospital instead of living at home. It brings about mortality rates that are as high as any psychiatric illness that we know of, and that the treatment for it is to get renourished. So that raises the question, well, why can't patients eat? And this is what I want to focus us in on now. So I'm going to show you what we've learned about what happens with eating in anorexia nervosa. And it starts with a study from 2000 from Colleen Hadigan, who had the bright idea to actually measure what patients eat. And she kept track of all the calories that people ate in a day, comparing patients and controls. And this was observed intake, so it wasn't self-report, it was actually measuring and quantifying what people ate. And she found that, as you might have expected, the patients with anorexia nervosa ate less than the healthy controls. But that was actually important to know because it tells us that it's not that there's something metabolically different, it's that they're actually eating fewer calories. But not only that, it wasn't just fewer calories. She found that it was specifically fewer calories from fat. So this is the percentage of their daily diet that's coming from calories from fat. We then went on, so we have at Columbia, up in the Eating Disorders Clinic is in the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and we have, as part of our mission there, is to learn more about eating disorders while we're providing treatment for eating disorders. And we get these wonderful patient collaborators who are willing to participate and let us learn what their experience of eating is like. So this is not a patient, this is a research assistant who was kind enough to pose for this picture. But this is our research lab, we call it a laboratory. It's a room with a table in it. And in this particular study, what we did was we asked patients and healthy controls to come in and drink from this popcorn container. And inside the container is a strawberry yogurt shake. And they were told that this was their lunch for the day, have as much as you like. And what Robin Sisko did this study, and what she was actually trying to understand was something about satiety. She wanted to know whether there are internal cues that tell people when to stop eating and if those are different for patients with anorexia nervosa. And these were patients on our inpatient unit, so they came in and they participated in the study when they first got to the unit, and then they stay with us and they get renourished, and then they participated again and came back to the lab for lunch when they were fully weight restored. So this is like 6 weeks to 8 weeks later. They've successfully gotten renourished, and they've seen along the way improvement. These are all different psychological scales. So these are measures of eating disorder severity, depression severity. All these things have gotten better through the course of their treatment, which is wonderful. But their, spoiler alert, their restrictive intake continues. So she brought them to the lab, and they drank from that strange container where they can't see what it is. There's no clues at all. And first, healthy controls come into the lab. They sit, they drink about 500 grams of it. They might find it weird, but they finish it and leave. And the patients, however, so when they first come in, no big surprise, they eat very little. But 2 months later, fully weight restored, after all that treatment, when they come back into the lab, they still eat. This is not significantly different, these two. So they still barely eat in this laboratory setting. That was really important information. We learned a bunch of different things from that study. But what we didn't learn was, well, but what happens if it's not a strawberry yogurt shake in a popcorn container that they can't see, which is pretty much the scariest meal we could have chosen because there's no clues. So next we did a study where we provided them with, this is called a multi-item meal. We do this kind of study a lot. You're going to see this picture more than once in my talk. But this is that same laboratory room where there's basically a buffet on the table, and people come in and they pick whatever they want for lunch, and they let us know when they're done. And this gives us the ability to look at more about eating patterns. But again, we found that healthy controls, when they come into the laboratory setting, they eat about the same thing each time. They eat about 800 calories. Patients, when they first come to the hospital, eat significantly less. And here, after weight restoration, they still eat significantly less than healthy controls. This is actually a meaningful improvement. However, while patients are getting treatment, they're accustomed to eating about 1,000 calories a day for lunch. So even though this is better than this, it's half of what they need at that point. So we're still seeing that at this time point, they really can't eat. And we're still seeing that it's primarily calories from fat that they're restricting. One slide to, if I haven't convinced you yet, show you another way that we learned that this matters, which is that we looked at eating patterns in patients after they had received treatment and they were weight restored. And we kept track of everything that they ate for 4 days, and found that how they eat, the pattern of eating. So not just, these were patients who were all on basically the same calorie prescription, so they were being instructed to eat the same amount of calories per day, but it was the end of treatment, so they have a little more opportunity for choice about what they're eating. And in that setting, the patients who ate a diet that was lower in energy density, which means, kind of means fat. It's not exactly the same as fat, but fat will contribute to energy density. So patients who are eating a diet lower in energy density do worse a year later. And patients who are eating the same thing every day, so they have less diet variety, they also tend to do worse a year later. So these patterns of eating, the kinds of choices that they're making at this stage of treatment matters for longer-term outcome. So my point up till now in the story is really to say that this is the key place we need to look at what's going on in anorexia nervosa. This eating behavior is a key disturbance. They restrict, they keep restricting even with tons of treatment, and their patterns of eating are disturbed, and that predicts relapse. Okay, so that gets us back to the question, well, why can't they eat? And what one of the things that is important to communicate about the illness is that they can't. So there's something going on there. Those people, the people that were participating in those studies were people who were in treatment. They wanted to get better. They were engaged and trying and working so hard every single day. And when you put them back in a situation where they have to make decisions for themselves about eating, they aren't able to make decisions to adequately nourish themselves. So to understand what's going on there, we started to turn to cognitive neuroscience, and actually this is where the collaboration with Daphna Shohami begins. It turned out that we could learn a lot from what cognitive neuroscientists know about behavior in general. And in a very broad strokes, one way to think about that is that behavior can be broken down into the kinds of things that you do on purpose, behaviors that are goal-directed, where you know what you want and you set out to do it, and behaviors that are a little more automated or termed habitual. And these different types of behavior have different characteristics, they're learned in different ways, and they have different neural substrates. And this was a very interesting new direction for us, that we could think about the kinds of decisions and choices that patients are making and try to understand what types of learning characteristics are there and what types of neurobiology would that point us towards. What are the neural mechanisms of eating in patients with anorexia nervosa? One point that I was just talking about but didn't put on the slide here is that we know a lot about eating. We know a lot about the biology of eating behavior, but it turns out that all the things that we know about normal eating are not the things that are disturbed in anorexia nervosa. So if we're going to understand what's going on with this illness, we need to understand the rest of the neural mechanisms of behavior. The difference between these two types of learning was graphically set out for me by a Barnard undergraduate who I'm working with who put it this way. Let's say you decide to go on a 100-day cookie dough challenge. And this here is the cookie dough. And you're going to eat it every day for 100 days. The first day you get to have it, you're quite excited to be pursuing your very rewarding cookie dough, and you say that's delightful and that's very rewarding. By the 100th day, maybe it's a little less delightful, but by now, it's become a routine, and it's just going to be something that you're going to do every day no matter what. At this point, the behavior is what's called outcome independent. So you don't really care that much anymore about the rewards of the cookie dough, but you kind of just do it anyway because it's become part of your routine. So that is one way to think about the difference between the goal-directed behavior and then the more habitual outcome independent behavior. When we started thinking about behavior that way, we were thinking about the kinds of things that happen in anorexia nervosa, and that habitual behavior, which is defined as it's not innate, it's something that's learned, it occurs repeatedly, it becomes fixed, doesn't take much conscious effort, and it can be sort of set off by a bunch of different cues. And that led us, and primarily set out by Tim Walsh, the habit-centered model of anorexia nervosa. So now we started thinking, all right, well, what happens with patients with anorexia nervosa is they start out with some kind of a diet. And when I say diet, I simply mean that their energy intake was not sufficient for their energy needs, so that they start to see their weight go down. Now, for some people, that's very much on purpose. They decide that they want to change their eating patterns and they want to lose weight. And for some people, they want to eat healthy, or they want to do, there's all kinds of different individualized narratives for this. But something happens where they're dieting, and then somehow it's rewarding. And the ways in which it can be rewarding can be totally idiosyncratic for different individuals. But something happens that's rewarding, and then the dieting gets repeated. And with repetition, then it becomes that kind of behavior that is more fixed and is more habitual. And with that, importantly, shifts to a different neural substrate. So, and that is the dorsal striatum. So this led us to the hypothesis that persistent maladaptive food restriction in anorexia nervosa might be considered a habit, where the dieting that begins on purpose becomes just something that persists no matter what in the setting of the cue, where the cue is your everyday life, basically. Okay, so before I go into this next bit about habit, I want to turn to a metaphor that was given to me by one of the patients that we work with, because we started talking about this habit idea on the inpatient unit, and the patients got it. And the one patient told me that what happens with eating in anorexia nervosa is sort of like a wheelbarrow, where the wheelbarrow gets stuck in the rut. And I thought that was such a great metaphor, and started using it with other patients. And then she told me that, in fact, it wasn't her metaphor, it came from Mama Bernstein of the Bernstein Bears, and she sent me this book in which Mama Bernstein says, "It's sort of like this path. I've wheeled this barrow over it so many times that it's worn a deep rut right down the middle, and it keeps getting deeper every time I use it. It's so deep now that I can't get out of it without a little help." This has been a metaphor that we've stuck with, and I think I'm going to get to tell you why in a moment. But part of why I talk about it with that story is that in some ways there's nothing new under the sun. In some ways, Mama Bernstein saw this problem coming, but we now have an opportunity to really test this using some of the tools from cognitive neuroscience. So what we did in our collaboration was take this problem of not eating, which is a very challenging thing to study, because not eating is the absence of a behavior, and I have a feeling that that's been a part of what's kept the field stuck and unable to move forward in understanding the neuroscience of this, because how do you study the absence of a behavior? Well, it turned out that the advances in understanding decision-making allowed us to shift from thinking about it as not eating to thinking about it as actually the selection of low-fat foods. So it's not that the patients aren't eating, it's that they're making particular choices that lead to inadequate intake. So to test this, we adapted a task that actually was already existed to study value systems and other types of decision-making using food as a way to tap into understanding decisions. And we took the task from Todd Hare's group and took our own pictures so that the foods that we were asking patients about include a whole range of things that you might be eating, things that would come up in the course of a day. So in our task, there are 76 different foods. Half of them are considered high-fat foods, and half of them are considered low-fat foods. I'm going to actually show you what happens in the task. The first part of it, everyone is asked to rate the food according to how healthy they think it is. So they're given this instruction. You're going to see a series of pictures of food, rate how healthy it is. And then they see all 76 of the food items, and they rate them on a scale from unhealthy to healthy, where neutral is in the middle. And then they're asked to rate it for how tasty it is. And they do the same thing for all 76 items, rating it from bad to good, where neutral is in the middle. And then they're given this instruction that you're going to be asked to choose a food to eat. And the computer has selected one food item. This part isn't in the instructions, but the computer has selected one food item that's actually neutral on both of those value systems. So an individualized neutral item, and they're choosing between that, which is called the reference food, and then all those other food items. And they're asked to choose on each trial what they would prefer. And they're told that at the end of the task, they're going to get one of these foods as a snack. And that makes especially the participants who are struggling with anorexia nervosa very engaged in making their choices according to what they would actually want to eat. And then this is what they see on the choice trial, where the thing on the left stays the same and the food on the right keeps changing through all the 76 different items, and they just indicate which ones they prefer. I'm going to show you, we did the task in the scanner, and I'm going to show you the results of the task in a minute. But what we also did was after patients do the task in the scanner, the next day they come back and they do the meal with us again. And they're given, you can see the table's a little bit different. We actually added some food items, so we had to make the table bigger, so it looks like there's less on the table, but there's actually more on the table. And you can see here the little bell that they press to just tell us when they're done. What I'm showing you here, we've done the task now in a number of different populations, and we have been rather pleasantly reassured to find that what's important about this task is that the kinds of choices that people make in it actually relate to their eating behaviors. So what you're looking at here is the amount of food, the calories that they eat in the meal, and what you're looking at here is the percentage of time that they chose the high-fat food over the reference item. So on all those different trials, they're choosing between something neutral and something that's either high-fat or low-fat. And the percentage of time that an individual is willing to choose the high-fat food is actually related to how they eat and the kinds of decisions that they're making about eating. So this task then gives us a way to look at what is happening when patients with anorexia nervosa are making decisions about food. And this feels like the key question to understand what are the neural mechanisms around decision making around this critical area. Okay, here's what we find. So this first part just shows you that everybody can tell the difference between the high-fat and the low-fat foods, so that everybody rates the low-fat foods as healthier. These are the tastiness ratings, and you can see that both low-fat and high-fat foods are reasonably similar in their ratings. You'll also notice that the patients with anorexia nervosa, who are in green, rate food lower on pretty much every metric, so they just kind of don't value the food as much. But they're otherwise similar to the healthy controls in their ratings. And here's what we were really looking at, which is the choice block. So here you're looking at the percentage of time that they choose the high-fat, either the low-fat food or the high-fat food over the reference item. And not surprisingly, as you would expect, the patients with anorexia nervosa choose the high-fat food significantly less often than the healthy controls. This is not a surprising finding, but it tells us that the task captures exactly this thing that we're trying to understand, which is what happens with decision-making about food, which is the central problem for the patients with anorexia nervosa. And then we looked at what was going on in their brains. So while they were doing the task, they're actually in an MRI scanner, and the MRI is telling us not just a picture of their brain, but it's telling us which parts of their brain are active, where the blood flow is going while they're doing the task. And the way that we looked at the data was to look at which parts of the brain in which parts of the brain is the activity associated with making that choice. So this gives us a measure of what parts of the brain are guiding or are related to the food choices. And this top part here is looking at a decision-making or sort of value-based decision-making region. And you can see that both healthy controls and the patients with anorexia nervosa show activity in this value-based region. But if you look down here at the dorsal striatum, which is that more habitual-based region, only the patients are showing activity. So then we looked and compared the two directly, and you can see that there's no difference between the groups in their value in this value-based or reward system. But down here in the dorsal striatum, there's a significant difference where the patients are showing activity in the dorsal striatum that's related to the choices that they're making, and the controls are not. Okay, so that tells us something new and exciting and opens a whole new pathway for us in trying to understand what's going on in anorexia nervosa. It doesn't necessarily answer the question about habit, because it just tells us that there's a brain region that's active, that's different, which is a big deal. There is a difference in the kinds of brain mechanisms that are helping people with anorexia nervosa make choices than people who've never had anorexia nervosa. So that's a great starting point for us. But if we're trying to understand whether or not this is a habit, we also came at that from a more behavioral angle. And for this, we found a way of measuring the strength of habit. So this is a scale that comes from, not from the psychiatric literature, but from behavioral science, and is a way of measuring how routine or what's the habit strength of different things people do. And we asked the patients to think about their routines, and we asked people without anorexia nervosa to think about their routines and provide us with an example of something that they think of as a habit for them or a routine for them that falls into this category of restrictive eating or eating low-calorie food. So they would give us an example like, I choose skim milk or low-fat yogurt or whatever it is. And then they rate it on all these different questions, whether they rate it for the frequency, for the automaticity, and then for this kind of that typically me thing is part of it too. So this is sort of how entrenched is this behavior for you? And we compared behavior for patients with anorexia nervosa with healthy controls. This actually comes from a group at MGH that looked at this same scale and found that the strength of habit on the scale matched other ways of looking at restrictive eating. So it sort of provides some circumstantial support that habit strength matters for restrictive intake. And we looked at a series of four types of behaviors. Wow. Four types of behaviors in the patient population, things that have to do with restricting intake, things that have to do with delay eating, compensating for eating, and rituals around eating, and found that the ways that patients describe, and again, both patients and controls are picking things that they think of as habits, but the strength of it, the frequency and automaticity is much higher for the patients than it is for the healthy controls. The reason I'm mentioning this part of it is part of what people wonder about when we finish talking about the brain imaging findings is, well, what is that? What are the implications? What does that mean for the illness? What would you do differently if it's a habit? And what we decided to do was probe that question by developing a behavioral intervention. What would you do if something was more habitual? So if you go back to the very first description of the two different types of behavior, there's some kinds of things that you do on purpose where you want to get a particular reward, and there's some kinds of things that you just do because you just do it. The stimulus sets it off. So if you're going to try to intervene for a behavior that's a little more automated like that, then you have to get in at the cue part of the chain, not at the end of it. So talking to people about why they should change their behavior, or telling them, here are the ways in which anorexia nervosa is so dangerous for you, and here are the kinds of things you should do differently, isn't very effective because it's not in that part of the brain. So if we're right, if that's true, then it should be important to focus on the cues for the behavior. So we developed a kind of proof of concept, brief behavioral intervention that we can do on our inpatient unit. So again, in collaboration with the patients who come to get their treatment with us, we did a small, very small, these are 11 people in each group, randomized control trial where half the people got our behavioral intervention that focuses on cues, and half the people got what's called supportive psychotherapy, which is the kind of thing that you would do to help somebody on an inpatient unit. So it's a very reasonable way to provide care, but it doesn't focus in quite the same way on the specifics of the behavior. And we found that the group that got our cue-dependent, cue-focused intervention were able to, this was a 4-week study, 12 sessions, and in those 12 sessions, they showed a significant decrease in the habit strength. So that gives us another kind of behavioral marker, sort of a proof of concept that there's something about this habit strength that we can tap into, and it's a good target for treatment, but it doesn't quite answer the question of whether or not it's important. So what we did again was we asked patients to have that same meal with us before and after the treatment. And we found that the patients who got the cue-focused intervention showed not quite significant, but for 11 in each group, it's a pretty good start for proof of concept that they have an increase in their calorie intake compared to the patients who, remember I showed you in the beginning how incredibly hard it is to change eating behavior, that we bring patients into this laboratory and we see no change after all those months of treatment. With 4 weeks of focusing on the behaviors a little bit more closely and really looking for the cues that precede the behavior, we see a change in eating, or we saw it in this study. So that brings us to our next set of questions, which is, how does this happen? And for that, we are trying to tackle this question in 2 ways. One, by looking at the relationship between the brain and behavior across the spectrum of restrictive eating. So I've shown you that patients with anorexia nervosa, when they're stuck in this illness, have this particular neural pattern that seems to guide their behavior. What about people who are making restrictive choices for other reasons? So what about people who are have an eating disorder and are struggling with all the symptoms of an eating disorder, but they don't quite have the starved brain. They're not quite as medically underweight. They may be as impaired in other ways, but they're not quite as medically starved as the group with anorexia nervosa. So what happens in their brains when they're making those same kinds of restrictive choices? And similarly, what about people who don't have an eating disorder at all, but have decided to make some changes in their eating patterns and are dieting, let's say? What's going on in their brain in the relationship between what's guiding their restrictive food choices? And then our second question is, what about earlier on in the illness? So if this is a habit that develops over time, how much time does it take to develop, and what does it mean about the longer-term outcome of the illness? So for the first study, where we're looking across the spectrum, what we're wondering is whether, is it the case that habitual control, or this dorsal striatum mechanism, comes in once anorexia is established, or is it late in the course of anorexia nervosa, or where in this zone? Is it as soon as something becomes pathological? What is it that triggers this kind of guiding of behavior compared with what would be considered non-eating disorder? This is sort of what our hypothesis is, that earlier on in the illness and or before, or when it's not an illness, maybe there's more of these goal-directed mechanisms that are responsible for behavior. And then our other set of questions is about teens. So we're looking at, I mentioned that the mean age of onset of this illness is 14 to 8, is mid to late adolescence, by which I mean ages 14 to 18. So we're looking at teens who have anorexia nervosa. Oh, and this is why we're looking at teens who have anorexia nervosa. And we're wondering whether there's a difference in the mechanisms that are guiding choice behavior for them. So we happen to know from other studies that, first of all, that adolescents are more sensitive to reward to begin with. And then we have seen in our younger population with anorexia nervosa that there's a difference in the connectivity, the sort of baseline architecture in the reward system. And we've also have this hint that if we look, even in our sample where overall it was the dorsal striatum that was guiding choice behavior, if we look just at the younger ones, we see a hint that maybe there's actually more reward system and more of that sort of goal-directed idea that might be related to choice behavior. So if that's the case, we're wondering whether early on in the illness, maybe there's more of this sort of more goal-directed, more reward system activity related to choice. And maybe when the illness progresses, so we're going to follow people over a couple of years and see whether there's a relationship between the duration of illness or the severity of illness, or if we can sort of figure out what happens over a couple of years of having anorexia nervosa compared to a bunch of adolescents who don't have any illness, and are there differences in their development and then in their brain mechanisms that are guiding food choice. So with that, I want to thank you. I will say that for this study, we need a lot of patience and we need a lot of healthy controls so that we can understand the differences. So if you want to join us, and we look very friendly, I think, in this picture, you are welcome to be collaborators with us and contribute to science. So thank you very much. I think it's you. Oh, I think you're supposed to moderate the questions.
Thank you, Joanna. We're going to be happy to take questions. There is a mic here. If anybody wants, if you have a question, please come up to the mic.
I don't know if I missed it, but what was the cue-focused intervention you did in the study? Should I yell?
So the question was, what was the cue-focused intervention? And what we did was we worked with patients to develop a sense of what they would describe as their routines, and then we had them think through a timeline of what led up to each of those behaviors. So we picked behaviors that were important for the illness, not any habit. You know, everybody has habits. That's part of the normal way the brain works. But we would identify routines that they felt were probably contributing to the illness, and then think through the timeline of what happened before you did that, and what happened before you did that, and what happened before you did that, and see if we could find a spot really early in the chain of behavior where they might be able to take a different path.
Other questions?
To ask a question. Thank you so much for the interesting lecture. So maybe like in general terms, do you think there are biological similarities between patients with bulimia and anorexia? And a sort of a follow-up to one of the slides where you mentioned that anorexia patients do not get better with medication. And I think it's commonly accepted that bulimia patients do benefit from medication. If you could elaborate, what might be behind it.
I don't know what's behind it, but I can elaborate. It's a really interesting difference. I mean, there's so many similarities between the illnesses. They're both illnesses where there's a disturbance in body image and perception of shape and weight, and they're both characterized by these persistent maladaptive eating behavior patterns. The difference is probably about the starvation of the brain. There is something about starvation that just must change the way the brain functions that makes a difference in terms of the neurobiology of the two illnesses. Having said that, there are many people who over time may have had, in the course of a lifetime, can have had both illnesses. So there are many people who shift from having had anorexia and then later in life having bulimia nervosa. So we don't understand how that happens exactly, but it is useful to separate the two and try to understand what it is about anorexia nervosa, and then it will be necessary to try to figure out what is it that's also similar across the two patterns. In terms of the medication, it is absolutely true that many randomized controlled trials have shown that medications can be very helpful for bulimia nervosa. Most medication trials for anorexia nervosa have been disappointing, which again speaks to there being some neurobiology to this illness that's different. And we'll keep figuring it out. If we can figure out the neurobiology, we can figure out new medicines that may be helpful for anorexia too.
So I wanted you to clarify, like, what exactly was happening in the brain. Like, was it that in these patients, the certain parts of the brain were like being overstimulated and like they were like overworking? Is that why?
So it's a great question, because the way that we looked at I wish I could put the picture back up, but the way that we looked at what's going on in the brain wasn't exactly a comparison to say, is the brain more active in one group than the other? The first part was just looking at, if you were to look at which parts of the brain are active, so while you're doing something, some part of your brain must be involved in that, which parts of it show activity that is correlated with whatever the behavior is that we're particularly interested in. So we were looking to see, while you're making those choices, which parts of the brain are showing activity that goes along with that. And then we looked and compared the two groups and saw that that there was a difference in the dorsal striatum for only one group having activity associated with choice. Does that clarify that?
Hi, I wanted to ask, does geographic location or economic class affect anorexia nervosa?
Yeah, yes and no. I think the most important point is that the illness affects, it doesn't discriminate. It affects across socioeconomic status. It affects across many populations. It does seem to be the case that we don't see the illness in populations where there is famine, for example. If you're thinking about it in extremes. And it is certainly the case that that it's more recognized in Western countries. I don't think we've quite nailed why that is yet. I think there's a lot more to know, but certainly in the people that we take care of, there's nobody who's completely protected.
Hi, I have two questions. My first question is, so if you consider the habitual nature of it and you think of that as maybe a manifestation of an OCD behavior, and if OCD can be treated with medication such as SSRIs, then why do you see that anorexia is not treated?
We share your question. It is true that this idea of what drives persistent maladaptive behavior can be asked across a range of behavioral disorders. So the question comes up around substance use disorders and around OCD, both of which are illnesses where people continue to do something even though they have decided they'd rather have treatment, or even though it's maladaptive at that point. And there are hints that there are some shared mechanisms across these illnesses, but the key question for us keeps coming back to, well, then why doesn't the medication strategy help as much in anorexia nervosa as it does in other illnesses? And the best guess I have is back to this starvation biology, that there must be something about the kind of hit that the brain takes with starvation that affects things that are different from other illnesses.
Okay, thank you. And my other question is, do you think that you will start diagnosing anorexia through fMRIs, or do you think it will always be a DSM diagnosis?
I personally would diagnose people with a conversation more than with an fMRI.
Okay, even if you see that activation in the dorsal striatum that you wouldn't find in none.
So one way to think about that is, are there biomarkers for anorexia nervosa that might be helpful for us? And I could imagine that we will find the biomarkers that will tell us things about who's going to do well with which kind of treatment, or what kinds of interventions we might need for different people. And that, I think, is where understanding the neurobiology more might be incredibly important. The illness is actually, compared to the rest of psychiatry, in some ways, we have more objective information to go on than a lot of the other illnesses that we struggle to diagnose.
Okay, thank you.
So a follow-up to the first of those two questions. I mean, since you find that there's this overactivation of the striatum, in terms of thinking of the mechanism, is it the case that people with anorexia nervosa also have a tendency to have other disorders that you would consider addictions, right? So is it just the case that it's very easy to fall into any habitual pattern?
Right. We've also had that question around avoidance patterns and phobic patterns, and wondered whether there are ways in which these patients are afraid of food. Are they prone to picking up avoidance behaviors? Are they prone to picking up repetitive patterns? There is a significant overlap or comorbidity with OCD, so that would support that idea. The comorbidity with substance use disorders isn't that high for anorexia nervosa. It's higher for bulimia nervosa. So I don't know, but I do think that we will be able to say more about that as we're asking these questions in different ways.
Thank you.
I wanted to know if there's any weight given to environmental and cultural factors on getting this disease.
Right. So the number one risk factor for development of anorexia nervosa, the only thing that we know of, is the change in weight. So that a setting where, and this was actually part of the answer to the question about culture too, the presence of dieting is potentially contributing to the development of an eating disorder, in the sense that if you are not vulnerable to anorexia nervosa at your normal body weight, but then for whatever reason, potentially related to cultural pressures or what have you, that you go on a diet, you are going to cross a threshold that brings out a vulnerability to the illness. On the other hand, dieting is ubiquitous, and anorexia is rare. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much. This is really amazing work. I think you just answered half my question, but I have heard also a bit about personality playing a role in who develops anorexia. How true is that? Is that a myth? What do you have to say about that?
There's so many things to say about that. So part of it is that there are aspects of what you think of as personality that are affected by starvation. So there were a lot of theories about the role of sort of psychodynamic theories about the role of conflict and mothers and things like that in the development of anorexia nervosa, until the psychology of starvation became abundantly clear. And then the kinds of things that people thought of, like control, as driving anorexia nervosa, turn out to be actually symptoms of starvation as well. So that really changed the thinking that the primary problem here is this issue of eating behavior, and if we can help people with the behavior, then we see a lot of changes in the other things, like things that you might think of as personality. Having said that, there are certain traits that do seem to be more prevalent in anorexia nervosa, but not universal. So I think those are potentially relevant for some of the biomarker ideas that we were talking about, or kind of helping to differentiate who's going to do well with what, but they are probably secondary to this main problem of the eating itself.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. You probably kind of answered on my question before, the previous people that asked the questions. But my question is, I'm really happy that you said about habits, because I'm pretty sure that it's all about choice. We all make choices every single day. It's all in our brain. And my question is, do you think it's important for us to realize that each individual has a history, we have a background which kind of, influence on our everyday decision-making process, which kind of, maybe you can help me with that every single time that we choose the food or whatever, everything, it's all about our history, it's all about what's going on, our fears. And what I think is very important to understand, that if there is psychological problems, which is that we have to talk about like psychological process of that. that can bring?
So one way to tackle that is everybody brings their individual story to their illness. When we think about treatment, we focus on what are the common mechanisms, the places we know we need to intervene to help somebody get better. And then when somebody's in a place of health, there's a lot more ability to work with the rest of any individual experiences or stories. So in terms of treatment and the psychology of it, the significance of weight restoration first be understated or cannot be overstated. It is an absolutely critical first step, and it is incredibly hard.
Yeah.
So the kind of work that we do just to help people get through that first step is very intensive and very behavioral. And then for each person, there's a lot more to think about and understand beyond that. That would be the kind of treatment and psychology answer. There is kind of embedded in there another neuroscience question, which is kind of what is the role of memory in all of this? And I think that we haven't gotten there yet, but I hope we will be able to figure out how those interact as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Do you think that the distorted thoughts and the distorted body image that many anorexic patients have is also habitual?
Let's see. I don't quite know how to measure the habitual nature of a thought, but if you make the analogy to obsessions and compulsions, then you can probably link the dots in that way. So that, and we have tried to look at whether the ways that we measure habit are related to the ways that we measure kind of obsessionality or rigid thinking, and so we can figure out whether those two constructs are related. I don't, off the top of my head, know how I would measure whether the thought was a habit, but we certainly try to figure out the links if we can. Does that help?
I was wondering, you were talking about the how dieting can lead to it. That also kind of covers just the negative, like the energy deficit, right? Because it doesn't have to be from a diet.
Correct.
It can be
Absolutely.
from getting sick. It can be
Absolutely.
from like having surgery
Anything.
and losing a little bit
Absolutely.
of weight. But it's like, so an accidental energy deficit can set it off.
Absolutely.
Right. I just think that's important to like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also, what about the orbital frontal cortex? I guess what I was taught is that it underfires dopamine or something, and that's like, I don't know if you've heard of the New Fed TR program.
Of the what program?
New Fed TR.
No.
It's a program in Columbus. I think they work very similarly. That's why I was so interested in this. So basically what they were saying was the orbital frontal cortex stops firing the dopamine, and that's what kind of triggers the, well, not what triggers it, but that's what starts happening, and so you don't get the same dopamine spike from food.
I do know the program you're talking about, and I think that we share an effort to link the neurobiology with the illness and to help people really understand some of the points that you're making, that that it is critical to understand that there's a biology to this. The ways that has been put together is a little bit different, focuses on a different side of the reward system, I would say, and focuses on helping people to understand that there may be discrepancies in the way that they experience reward, and to the extent that that is valuable in helping people make very difficult changes, that I think we share the same outlook on that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I was just like, I see all the different brain parts and stuff, and I'm just trying to like sort it out. Thank you.
I know that it's caused by the two types of behaviors, but can another mental illness influence anorexia nervosa?
There are commonly a lot of mental health problems that can occur together. The ones that tend to occur with anorexia nervosa are anxiety disorders and depressive disorders. the idea of which one is primary, we tend to decide that the anorexia nervosa is the primary problem, in part because of the severity of it and the medical, the dangerousness of it. So we focus on that as the primary problem, and then oftentimes with treatment there are other illnesses like anxiety disorders or depressive disorders, and rarely substance use disorders that also need a different kind of intervention.
So it's either it happens at kind of the same time, or AN influences another mental illness?
Certainly having anorexia nervosa makes a lot of other symptoms worse. So when we get people renourished, we see improvement in a lot of psychological symptoms, and we might see improvement in OCD, we might see improvement in phobias and fears, and in depressive symptoms. But for many people, even after that improvement, there's still another mental health process or problem that needs its own attention. We tend to stage them and deal with the anorexia first because it's just a critical illness.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Join me in thanking Joanna. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. Thank you to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for their sponsorship. Thank you all for coming and for your really engaged participation and questions. As Joanna mentioned, we're open to participation in many different ways, so please just contact us if you're interested in participating more in the work we do or in our research projects. And definitely please join us for our next lecture in February by Dr. Mike Shadlin, which I think will actually pick up on some of these threads to understand how decisions emerge from neurobiological mechanisms. Thank you very much.